In the early 1970s, a rat was placed inside a small metal cage with two water bottles. One bottle held ordinary water, the other held water laced with morphine, one of the most powerful narcotics ever isolated. The rat sampled both. Within days, it returned again and again to the drugged bottle, ignoring food, ignoring rest, pressing the same lever until its body finally gave out. Thousands of these experiments were run in laboratories around the world, and they all seemed to point toward a single, unshakable conclusion. Expose a mammal's brain to a drug this strong, and addiction is almost inevitable. The chemistry wins. The creature is helpless. For most of the 20th century, this was treated as settled science. Then a psychologist in Canada looked at those cages and noticed something that everyone else had walked past. The experiment he built to test his hunch was called Rat Park, and it would quietly overturn one of the most confident beliefs we had ever held about ourselves. His name was Bruce K. Alexander, a researcher at Simon Fraser University in British Columbia. Through the 1970s, Alexander watched the standard drug studies pile up, and a simple doubt began to gnaw at him. In every one of those experiments, the rat was alone. It lived in a cramped, empty box. It could not run, could not play, could not mate, could not touch another living creature. It was isolated, understimulated, and often surgically tethered to the very apparatus that delivered the drug. Alexander asked a question that sounds obvious once you hear it, but that almost no one had put on paper. Were these rats drugging themselves because morphine was irresistible, or because their lives had been reduced to nothing? Was the experiment measuring the power of the chemical, or the emptiness of the cage? To find out, Alexander and his colleagues, Robert Combs and Patricia Hattaway, decided to change one variable. Not the drug, not the dose, the home. In 1977, they built something no addiction lab had ever contained. They called it Rat Park. It was a plywood enclosure roughly 200 times larger than a standard cage, around 8.5 square feet of open floor. They painted the walls with a pleasant forest scene. They filled it with running wheels, tin cans to hide in, wood shavings to burrow through, and platforms to climb. Most importantly, they filled it with other rats, 16 to 20 of them, males and females together, free to socialize, to compete, to raise their young. Rat Park was not a prison. It was, for a laboratory rat, about as close to a good life as science could arrange. Then, the experiment began. Alexander split his animals into two worlds. One group lived alone in the old, cramped cages, exactly as generations of study rats had before them. The other group lived in Rat Park. Both groups were offered the same two bottles. One held plain water. The other held water sweetened and laced with morphine, tempting enough to overcome the drug's natural bitterness. The setup was identical. The only difference was the address. The isolated rats behaved just as the textbooks predicted. Alone in their boxes, they drank the morphine solution heavily, returning to it compulsively, consuming it day after day. This was the result the whole field expected. But the rats in Rat Park told a different story. Surrounded by companions and space and things to do, they largely left the drugged water alone. They would taste it, then wander off to wrestle, to explore, to sleep in a pile with the others. When the researchers measured the totals, the gap was staggering. By some measures, the isolated rats consumed nearly 19 times as much morphine as the animals living in Rat Park. Same drug, same dose, same sweetness. The chemistry had not changed at all. The only thing that had changed was whether the creature had a life worth staying sober for. Alexander pushed the experiment further because a critic could always argue that the Rat Park animals simply hadn't been hooked yet. So he took a group of rats and forced dependence upon them. For 57 days, their only source of water was the morphine solution. Their bodies adapted. By any pharmacological definition, they were addicted. Then he moved them into Rat Park and, for the first time, gave them a choice between the drug and plain water. According to the reigning theory, these animals should have been slaves to their chemistry, drinking the morphine to hold off the pain of withdrawal. Instead, most of them chose the plain water. They endured the discomfort of coming off the drug, flickers of withdrawal and all, in order to stay clear-headed enough to live in the community around them. Given something better than the drug, they walked away from it. The paper landed in 1978, and it did not detonate the way Alexander hoped. The prestigious journals Science and Nature declined it. The work was eventually published in the pharmacology literature, then largely set aside for years. This is where the story becomes a lesson, not only about addiction, but about how easily a whole field can misread its own data. For decades, the isolated rat drinking itself to death had been shown to the public as proof of the drug's terrible power. But Rat Park suggested that everyone had been reading the wrong variable. The original experiments had never truly isolated the effect of the chemical. They had accidentally been studying loneliness, boredom, and confinement, and blaming the results on morphine. The cage was never a neutral background. The cage was the cause. And there was already a real human experiment that seemed to whisper the same thing, one that no ethics board would ever have approved. During the Vietnam War, military doctors made an alarming discovery. Heroin was cheap, potent, and everywhere, and by some estimates, around 20% of American servicemen there had become addicted to it. Public health officials braced for a catastrophe, expecting tens of thousands of addicted veterans to flood home and never recover. A researcher named Lee Robbins was commissioned to follow them. What she found defied everything the era believed about heroin. Once the soldiers left the jungle, the fear and the misery behind and returned to their families, their neighborhoods, and their ordinary lives, roughly 95% of them simply stopped. No lengthy treatment, no relapse. The drug had not rewired them for life. When the environment changed, the addiction, for most of them, dissolved. It was Rat Park, playing out on a battlefield with human beings. None of this means the chemistry is imaginary. Withdrawal is real. Some substances grip harder than others, and some people carry a heavier genetic or psychological load than their neighbor ever will. Alexander himself was careful never to claim that environment is the whole story. Later, researchers debated his findings, and replication proved messier than a clean headline would suggest. But the core insight survived the scrutiny, and in the decades since, it has quietly reshaped how the most thoughtful clinicians understand the problem. Addiction is rarely just a chemical hook sunk into a helpless brain. It is very often a response to a cage, an attempt to fill an absence of connection, purpose, safety, and belonging. The drug is frequently not the disease. The drug is the bandage over it. That reframe changes what a solution is supposed to look like. If addiction were purely chemical, the only answer would be to fight the chemistry, to punish, to isolate, to lock the sufferer further away from everything. But if a great deal of addiction grows in barren ground, then the treatment is not another empty cage. It is the opposite. It is reconnection. It is a reason to come back to the world. Places that have tried this approach, offering people belonging and dignity instead of only punishment, have watched addiction rates fall in ways the old model could never explain. So the enduring image from all of this is not the rat drinking itself to death in a lonely box. It is the second rat, the one already dependent, already suffering, who was handed something better and chose it. That rat did not have any say in the walls that were built around it. We do. We are the ones who decide, together, how empty or how rich the world we live in will be. The subjects never got to choose their cage. We still can, and what we build for one another next is entirely on us.